Okay, this is 101, week 7, part 5, but again, valuable for all my classes. So, you should be using other people's words and ideas in your paper, but you gotta say in the paper where they came from, which means you gotta put the name of the author and the name of the book in front of the quote, and if it's the exact words, you gotta use quotation marks. And the only times when you don't have to do that, or is if it's common knowledge, like something everybody knows, like who's the President of the United States, or if it's the kind of thing that's in like a million different textbooks, all like the day World War II ended. But for everything else, you got to say where you got it from. Anytime you use the exact words of somebody, even if it's just like 2 words, if those aren't the words you would have chosen to say that, then you're going to need to put quotation marks there, and you're going to need to have some information about where that came from. Now, some of that information has to do with MLA citation, which is the bibliography at the end of the paper. And you need to do that correctly. Because again, some people consider an incorrect bibliography to be plagiarism. I am not one of those people, but there are people who believe that. And again, some people are looking for an excuse. So there'll be another video series where I'll talk about how to do that. Squirrels are going crazy. Okay. So if you put someone else's exact words in your paper, you better put quotation marks around those words, and you probably ought to say, you almost certainly should say where you got those words from. Also, if facts are not widely known, so if you've got a fact that's not known by everybody, you got to put that in your paper. My students, for example, love to like chuck statistics into their paper, which is okay. I don't tell students to do that, by the way, because it's kind of extra work to go, because you have to do this thing I'm about to say, which is you got to say where you got it from. So some of my students will be like, 50% of all marriages end in divorce. Actually, that's probably a bad example. That's one of those things that's probably in a lot of sources, sort of like the end of World War II. But most statistics are not something that's like obviously known everywhere. So if you want to say like the percentage of people that are, struggling with mental illness, for example, you got to say where you got that statistic from. So a lot of my students will just chuck statistics into their paper without saying where they got them from. So if it's a fact not widely known, every time you do that, and again, I don't ask you for statistics. You don't have to have statistics in your papers. I mean, sometimes there's a research paper and I ask you for a couple of sources, but it doesn't have to be. Some students will throw in statistics to a paper that's not even asking for them, which creates double work actually, because you got to put the statistics in and then you got to say exactly where you got it from. You can't just be like, oh, everybody knows. Everybody does not know what percentage of people struggle with bipolar disorder. And if you say a percentage, you better have a source. Meaning, I need to know why you think that's true. You gotta put the quotation or the information about where you got that from has got to be in the paper, either in the sentence itself or at the bottom, or really both. It's got to be both in the paper, and the information's got to be located at the bottom. If you're quoting somebody else's opinion on something, you gotta put the person's name somewhere in the paper. It's got to be there. If it's not yours, right? If you're using somebody else's opinions or idea. Now here's a tricky one. Well, here's a simple one. If you co-wrote the paper, like let's say you and someone else wrote it together as a team, you better fucking put that second person's name on the paper. You better have both your names at the top of the paper. Now the problem is if you, for this class, for example, if you co-write the paper with your mom, if you don't put your mom's name, if you and your mom work on the paper together, and you sort of co-author it, you're both working on it. To avoid plagiarism, you got to put your name and your mom's name at the top of the paper and say, this is we wrote this together. Now the problem is that if you do that, I'm going to say you can't do that because this is a class where you have to do your own work. You're not supposed to be collaborating with your mom. So the problem is people don't want to say they co-wrote it with their mom, because they will essentially you get a 0 either way, right? Because if you don't say your mom co-wrote it with you, and I catch you, then it's plagiarism and it's a 0. But if you do say you co-wrote it with your mom, then you get a 0 because that's not the assignment. That's not what I asked for. Actually, it'd probably give you an F+ if half the paper was yours. But like the point is because then essentially you turn to the paper that's too short, meaning the part you wrote was too short. So you got to say when people are helping you, but of course sometimes you're supposed to do these things on your own and no one's supposed to be helping you at all, which is the case for most of your assignments in school. You're supposed to do it on your own. And so if you have someone co-writing it with you, if you leave their name off, it's plagiarism. And if you put their name on, you didn't really do the assignment the way you were asked to do it. So you kind of lose either way on that one. And it's slightly more complicated than this, and I know this is something that's kind of hard to imagine or picture, but one of the things we're doing in this school is we're trying to, I know it seems like, to a lot of my students, school is just like a game, where there are, like, when you play a game, there are rules, but when you leave the game, none of those rules are in effect, right? Like, so like in chess, you can only move the pieces in certain ways, but like, you can just pick up a piece and throw it across the room. Who's going to stop you? So a lot of my students feel like teachers have these rules for school, like here's how you get a good grade, and here's what paper should look like, and do this. But this is supposed to train you for the real world. It's not just supposed to be, I'm going to teach you how to follow the rules in college, and then when you leave, you won't need this stuff anymore. It's supposed to be a skill. So I know this is hard to picture, and many of my students really hate writing essays, but theoretically, you might someday write something that's so good that you want to publish it somewhere, in a magazine or the Atlantic Monthly or New Yorker or something. There are lots of places who will publish your work. Not the Atlantic and the New Yorker; those are tough to get into. But the point is there are places that will publish what you write. If anybody helps you with your essay for publication, you're going to need to say that they helped you. Now, in class, I'm going to help you with your essays, right? Now, I know I'm helping you because if you turn in a first draft to me, I'm going to give you some notes, and then I'm going to give it back to you. You don't need to put my name on the second draft, even though I helped you. But if your essay is so good and you get it published, you fucking better have a little footnote that says, thanks to Professor Clock for helping me with this essay, because I'll be pissed off if I helped you with that draft and then you got it published in a fancy magazine. You should say that I helped you out, just say, thanks to Professor Clock, he's cool, he helped me with this thing, and it's surprisingly good looking or whatever, So you got to say something in there. About where you're getting help from. And I know it's hard to picture right now because you're in school and the only reason you're writing essays is professors are making you write essays. But the point is that anything that isn't directly by you, you got to say where you got it from every time. And of course, this, again, causes a whole other world of trouble because maybe you're supposed to do it by yourself, and so you don't want to admit that anybody helped you. But it's actually probably better to admit other people helped you because at least you're being nice to those people. Okay, so that's a huge part of plagiarism. I want to tell you a story about a student that I had one year when I was teaching plagiarism. It's one of my favorite student comments ever. Students have an extremely hard time telling the difference between plagiarism and copyright problems. These are two different things, but they look similar to a lot of my students. So one of my students said, I said, you have to turn in work that's your work, right? If you turn in a paper and you put your name at the top of the paper, that's you telling me it's your work. So one of my students said, well, wait a minute. If I pay somebody to write a paper for me, then I own it. It's my work, and I'm turning it in. That's kind of funny. I laughed. That's pretty good. It's pretty funny. The student does not understand plagiarism because, of course, it's if someone else writes the paper and you turn it in and say that it's yours, even if you paid that first person money and you now own the paper, it's still not your work. And here's the difference. Here's to explain. So a student was like, well, how come if I buy a paper from somebody else, if I pay someone to write a paper for me, then it becomes my paper, at which point I'm turning in my work. How do I know it's mine? I paid for it. But this doesn't work like this, and I'll tell you why. If you come to my house, right, you can watch my television, right? It's my television. Why is it my television? Because I bought it. Okay, but that's different from claiming I built the television or I invented the television. Issues of who owns what is copyright, but issues of who created what plagiarism is about who created this thing, who put the ideas and the words in the paper. So if you buy a paper from someone else and you put your name on the top, you can't be like, well, it's my work, so I can't get in trouble. When you put your name at the top, you're not telling me you own the paper. When you put your name at the top, you're telling me you invented this paper. It is your work. Not that you have legal ownership of it in a sense that you paid money for it and now it's yours. Because there's a huge difference between telling people that you own a television versus telling people that you invented the television. And when you put your name in the paper, it doesn't indicate ownership, which is more of a copyright issue. It indicates that you invented it or created it or did the work, not that you paid someone else to do it. Okay, cool. All right, I'll see you guys in the next video.